Today on the Home Winemaking channel, I'm going to talk about how shockingly different red wine is from white wine. And what I mean here is the process to make it, it's wildly different. And it can help explain why there's often a pretty big price difference between a red wine and a white wine. And also why they just taste like they're not even from the same plant. So first we'll take a look at the grapes. Most wines you're going to buy from the store are the same species. They're from a grape species called Vitis vinifera. That's your classical European wine grape. So they shouldn't really taste that different, you would think. And to make matters even more maybe surprising is a white grape is really just a genetic mutation from a red grape. So for instance, Pinot Grigio is a genetic mutation of Pinot Noir. It's virtually the most identical grape, but Pinot Noir has these genes that create the color pigment. It's called anthocyanin. It's also contributing to the body of those big red wines. If you look at these grapes, you also might be surprised that we call them red grapes and white grapes when in fact they're green and dark purple, bluish, blackish. But it is what it is. We call them red grapes, we call them white grapes. Let's take a look at the vineyard. In the vineyard, for the most part, you're doing it pretty similarly. The trellises are similar. You're looking for these southern facing slopes. You're looking for good draining soils. What you'll see more often with red grapes though, is that they'll thin the clusters. So if each grape cane on that vine is going to make 3 clusters, they might thin it down to 1 or 2. They're getting a lot less tonnage per acre then, but it's helping to really ripen those grapes and build that dark, rich color and complexity in the wine. Where white grapes, you'll more often see pretty high tonnage per acre. So you can see right from the start that you start to see this a little bit more cost going towards the red wines. Now, when it comes time to harvest, you're looking at different things. A white grape is often picked at a pH of around 3.1 or 3.2, where a red grape, you're usually harvesting somewhere in the 3.5 range, maybe even 3.6. And some of these grapes, you might even see it harvest up into the 3.7 range. And that doesn't sound very different until you realize that the pH scale is logarithmic. So a pH of 3.0 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 4.0. So pretty dramatic difference right from the start there. And once you've harvested these grapes, you bring them to what's called the crush pad. So with a red wine, you'll run it through what's called a crusher destemmer. It will separate the berries from the stems and it'll pop all those little berries. And what you want to do with the red wine is ferment on the skins. It's an extractive process. You want to extract all that color from the skins. A lot of these red wines, if you were to just press them without all that skin time, what you'd have is what looks like a white wine. Sometimes you'll see this with Pinot Noir. Sometimes you'll see this with Cabernet Franc, where it is essentially a white wine, but it's made from red grapes. More often than not, all that color is coming from those skins. A white wine is almost the opposite. It's not extractive. You really don't want to extract from those skins. So what you're going to do is right off the vineyard, if you have the equipment to, you might actually whole cluster press, no crush, just squeeze that juice out. It takes a tremendous amount of pressure to do this. And basically that juice inside those grapes has had very little extraction time with those skins. What happens a little bit more often is you'll do a crush and then press. And you might even give it maybe 20 or 30 minutes on the skins to get just a little bit of extraction. Give that wine a little character, but for the most part, you're trying to minimize the things that are coming from those seeds and skins instead of trying to maximize the things that are coming from those seeds and skins, like polyphenols and tannins, all these kind of maybe harsher, more bitter compounds. As we get into the fermentation process, a red wine is kind of a air-friendly thing, because it has all these tannins, which are essentially antioxidants, it can take on a massive amount of oxygen. And this is kind of part of building this character. That oxygen helps kind of create these chemical reactions and help build that structure and body in that wine. So it's often done in open top fermenters. It could be a simple bin or barrel just out in the open. The skins are floating to the surface and you're pushing them down. And you do that 2 or 3 times a day. Just float up, push them down, float up, push them down, and you're extracting them just like you would extract a tea if you're making a tea, or just like you want to extract your coffee grounds. To encourage extraction, you're often fermenting at pretty high temperatures, up towards like 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty warm. Now take a look at white wine fermentation. Before you even get to fermentation, you'll cold settle it, or you'll run it through a kind of a gross filter just to filter out a little bit of that pulp. Because again, you're not trying to extract. You'll ferment it cold instead of warm, often down to like 55 degrees Fahrenheit, because what you're trying to do is you're no longer trying to extract, you're actually trying to preserve those volatile esters. So the things that smell fruity, you're trying to trap them in the wine, not let them heat up and blow away. So things you really don't care to keep in a red wine. You don't want this weird fruity red wine. You do want this kind of fruit on the nose of a white wine. So you ferment it cold. You're also often fermenting it in a more, you say sealed, but it's not sealed because it would build pressure, but a closed top container where oxygen's not really coming in quite as freely as during a red wine. So pretty much completely different. So different that it's almost as different as winemaking is to beer brewing. So when fermentation is over, on a white wine, you pretty much you're waiting for that wine to clear up. You'll get it off the yeast particles that have settled out, they call those the lees, and give it some time to clear up. A red wine, remember, it's still on those skins, so now you've got to press the wine. And now the fun's really just getting started. It's time now to put that wine through something called malolactic fermentation. So it's not the fermentation where the yeast eats the sugar. It's fermentation where a bacteria eats the malic acid and converts it into lactic acid. So that kind of sour tasting acid that you'll get in an apple, well, it's also in a grape, and it will be metabolized into lactic acid, which is smooth, kind of adds some texture to the wine. And it's not that you can't do this in white wine, it's just that more often than not, it's not done in white wine unless it's maybe like a Chardonnay. So again, we've talked about why there's a little bit more cost in a red wine. We keep racking up the numbers here. All these things are kind of labor intensive. You're monitoring things, you're testing things, you're adding bacteria that's not cheap, and you're just hoping that you don't have to intervene to keep things going smoothly. At this time, you'll also begin to oak the wine, which again, on a white wine, more often than not, it's not going to be oaked. So it's just a stainless steel tank, all relatively speaking pretty inexpensive compared to the cost of these French oak barrels and American oak barrels, which cost a fortune. And you can reuse them, but it's no longer a new oak barrel. So you're not getting that oak character, you're just getting the what they call micro-oxygenation that happens in oak. So this brings me to another point. So you're aging this in an oak barrel, and what's happening is that wine will evaporate through the pores of that oak, and then you'll open it up and top it back up with more wine, and do that every month, and you're basically concentrating that wine. Remember, this is primarily done for red wines, jacking up the price, and kind of explaining why these are just wildly different animals. And the red wine can take it. The red wine, again, I've mentioned, has all these antioxidants. So this kind of oxygen, not perfectly sealed environment of a barrel, a red wine, it kind of helps smooth things out. If you've ever drank a really young red wine, I mean like 3 months from harvest, it is harsh. It needs that time. It needs that oxygen to smooth out to where it can kind of level off and become where you want it to be to drink it. Now, some stuff that you'll see in white wine that you don't often see in red wine is, I've mentioned it's a little bit more acidic. We often have to cold stabilize it to crystallize these, if there's like an oversaturation of the acids. So it crystallizes the potassium or the tartaric acid into potassium bitartrate. You may know that as cream of tartar, and drop it out before we put it in the bottle because we don't really want that in the bottle. It just doesn't look nice. Another thing we'll often do with white wines that we don't so often do in red wines is we'll add some sort of fining agent. Often we'll add something like bentonite, which is a clay, during the fermentation process, and it will help bind up these proteins and drop them out, because if the wine heats up in storage, it can get a haze. You don't need these hazes. Often in a white wine, you'll add something called pectic enzyme. You're adding it not because you want to extract, but because you want to break down the pectin, because that could create a haze. Whereas you might add an enzyme in a red wine, but you're adding it because you want to break down that fruit and you want to extract as much as possible. So that's an interesting case where you're using the same product or similar product for completely different purposes. Now, for these big mass-produced wines, they're probably mostly going to be filtered. But as you get into these smaller, more boutique wineries, what you'll often find is that white wines are being filtered, especially because they often have malic acid. It makes them a little bit more friendly to a lot of bacteria that might want to eat that, and you don't want them to start doing their thing in the bottle. Where red wines, because there's no malic acid, there's often really little to no sugar remaining. It's pretty naturally has powerful antioxidants. You're often not gonna filter those. I personally never filter a red wine. I really honestly never really filter a white wine, but that's a unique micro scale problem. Once you get into these big wineries, you kind of have the power to effectively sterile ferment or sterile filter, so you're probably gonna do it. Please make sure to smash that subscribe button and go to patreon.com/makewine for more winemaking videos. This is now my full-time job, so I'm pretty scared I'm gonna go broke. Now, if there's something I missed here, which I'm certain there is, please mention it in the comments below. I love to hear what you guys have to say. I can't tell you how much more I've learned about wine just from reading your comments. And thanks for all your support, and thanks for watching.